The silence of the Donna's house. He didn't exile an enemy the night he told her to leave. He exiled the only reason anyone in that city still trusted him. Matteo Vossari stood at the top of the Valenti Empire, black stone mansion, 3 floors of power, a name that made grown men look at the floor. And he threw it all into the fire for a woman who didn't even know what she was burning. What happens when the most dangerous man in the city makes the one mistake no soldier, no rival, no federal investigation ever could? He forgets who built him. If this story already has its hooks in you, hit that like button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now stay close because this is only the beginning. The morning it happened, the sky above the Valenti estate was flat and white. The kind of colorless sky that doesn't promise anything. No storm, no sun, just a ceiling of nothing pressing down on the city like a held breath. Elara Varelli had been awake since 4, not because of anxiety. She had long since burned through her supply of that, but because the house made different sounds at 4 in the morning, and she had learned to listen. The creak of the 3rd-floor corridor, where the old wood still hadn't settled after 40 years. The hiss of the heating system cycling through the east wing, the particular silence of the guard rotation when the overnight team handed off to the early shift. She knew this house the way a surgeon knows the inside of a chest cavity, by touch, by memory, by years of paying attention when no one was watching her do it. She was in the kitchen when Alessandro found her, not the formal kitchen, the cavernous one they used for events, the small one, tucked behind the pantry, the one the staff used when they didn't want to be formal. She was standing at the counter with a cup of black coffee going cold in her hands, and Alessandro knocked twice on the doorframe before stepping in, which was the signal between them that what he was about to say required a moment to prepare for. "He got back at 2, Alessandro said. He was 61 years old, compact and precise in the way of men who had spent their lives serving serious households. His jacket was already on. It was 4 in the morning, and his jacket was already on. "I heard the car." Elara didn't look up from her coffee. He wasn't alone. She set the cup down on the counter with a sound that was barely a sound. "She came inside?" Elara asked. He brought her through the front entrance. The front entrance. She turned that over for a moment, not the private gate on the south side that Matteo used when he didn't want the household to see who he was arriving with. The front entrance, with its iron lanterns and the stone steps that had been worn smooth by 3 generations of Valentis coming and going. The front entrance meant something. Matteo Vossari did not do things accidentally. "Which suite?" she asked. Alessandro's pause was answer enough. Elara picked the coffee up again and drank what was left of it cold. Her hands were steady. Alessandro watched them because he was a man who understood that steadiness in a moment like this was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and he hadn't yet determined which. "How long has it been going on?" she said. Not a question. "I've had reports for about 7 weeks. I didn't bring them to you because you were hoping it would resolve itself." "Yes." "It didn't." "No, Donna, it didn't." She rinsed the cup and set it on the drying rack and said, "Get me a full account of who she arrived with. Drivers, assistants, anyone she brought onto the property. I want it before 6. "Of course." "And Alessandro." She turned then and looked at him directly, which she didn't always do. "How many of the staff know?" "All of them," he said. "They knew before I did." Elara nodded once, a slow and considered movement. "Then we move carefully." She went upstairs before the house woke up, moving through the corridors with the quiet economy of a woman who understood that in a house like this, how you carried yourself in a crisis was observed and remembered longer than the crisis itself. Camilla Laurent was 29 years old, and she had a gift for making rooms feel smaller when she entered them. Not because she was physically imposing, she was slight, with pale eyes, and the particular kind of beauty that photographed better than it landed in person, but because she occupied space with an assumption, the assumption that whatever was already in the room could be replaced by something that better suited her. Elara saw her for the first time at 9 that morning, crossing the main corridor of the east wing with one of Matteo's personal assistants hurrying along beside her. Camilla walked like someone who had already decided she was above the pace of the people around her. She was wearing clothes that cost money and carrying a phone that she glanced at every few seconds, and when she turned the corner and saw Elara standing at the end of the corridor, she didn't slow down. She didn't speed up either. She simply looked at Elara the way you look at furniture you've already decided to replace. A functional assessment, not a confrontation. Elara looked back at her with exactly nothing on her face. The assistant, a young man named Matteo, who had been with the household for 18 months and who was already sweating through his collar, made an abortive gesture toward an introduction. Camilla cut through it. "We'll need the Sable Room converted to an office by this afternoon," Camilla said, addressing Matteo as though Elara weren't there. "Clear everything out that's currently in it and have someone bring up a proper desk. Not the one from the storage level, something that looks like it belongs up here." Matteo looked at Elara. Elara said, "The Sable Room is where the household accounts are maintained." Camilla turned toward her then, the way someone turns toward a sound they weren't expecting. She looked at Elara for a moment, recalibrating something, and then she smiled. It was a very precise smile. "Then they can be maintained somewhere else," Camilla said. "This afternoon, Matteo." She moved past Elara without another word, her shoulder almost but not quite brushing the doorframe as she turned into the north corridor. Matteo looked like a man waiting to be told what to do with himself. Elara said, "Leave the Sable Room as it is. Tell anyone who asks that I've requested it." "She's going to go directly to Mr. Vasari," Matteo said quietly. "I know," Elara said. "Let her." Matteo was in the east study when Elara found him, which was where he always retreated when he wanted the appearance of working without the inconvenience of actually being available. He was behind the desk, and he looked tired in the way that men who hadn't slept looked tired. A particular grayness around the eyes, a slackness in the jaw that disappeared the moment he saw someone he needed to perform for. He saw Elara and didn't quite manage to compose himself in time, and that small failure of composure told her more than anything he was going to say to her. "We need to discuss the Sable Room," she said, closing the door behind her. "Elara." Someone gave Camilla Laurent the impression she could convert it into a personal office. "I assume that wasn't an instruction you intended to give without consulting me, so I wanted to clarify before there was any confusion." He leaned back in his chair. He was 52 years old and still physically substantial, the kind of man whose weight in a room was actual and not metaphorical, but in this moment he looked like someone who had gotten smaller overnight. "I was going to talk to you," he said. "About the room?" "About everything." The words sat between them. Everything. Elara looked at him without expression and waited, because she had learned over years of marriage to a man like Matteo Vasari that the fastest way to get to the truth was to stop filling silence. "She's staying," he said. "For a while. I want to—" He stopped, pressed 2 fingers to the bridge of his nose. "I want to make some changes." "Changes? The household doesn't need to run the way it's been running. Some of the arrangements are outdated. I'd like to— Matteo." She said his name quietly, and whatever he'd been about to say next died in his throat. "Look at me." He looked at her. "Say what you mean," she said. The silence stretched out long enough that the heating system cycled again, that familiar hiss through the walls. Matteo set his hands flat on the desk. "I want Camilla to have the Donna's suite," he said. The Donna's suite. 3 words. Elara felt them land, felt the precise weight of them, felt the way they moved through her chest like something going cold. The Donna's suite was the private apartment on the 3rd floor that had belonged to the woman who held the position of Donna in the Valenti household for as long as anyone in the organization could remember. It wasn't just a room, it was a designation. It was public. "You understand what you're saying," she said. "I do. You understand that once that changes, it can't be walked back quietly. I understand that. Every family connected to this organization will know by nightfall." "Elara." He said her name with something in it, not cruelty, not exactly, something worse. Exhaustion. "I know. I've made my decision." She stood there for another moment, and then she did something that Matteo clearly hadn't anticipated. She nodded. "Then I'll arrange to have my things moved," she said. You should probably have someone go through the household files before the transition. There are several standing agreements with families that require my signature, not yours. I'll brief whoever you designate before I— You don't have to leave the estate, he said. That's not what I'm saying. Yes, it is, Elara said. That's exactly what you're saying. She walked out before he could answer. The staff knew within the hour. Not because Elara told them, she didn't, but because the kind of household that had existed in the Valenti estate for 3 generations operated on an information current that moved faster than any formal announcement. Alessandro knew because Teo told him. The kitchen supervisor knew because Alessandro's expression when he passed through at 10:30 told her everything. The overnight guards who were still finishing their debrief knew because the overnight guards always knew. By 11, the Sable room was being cleared, not by Elara's people, by 2 men Elara had never seen before, who arrived with flat-panel dollies and began moving the filing cabinets into the corridor without asking anyone where they should go. Elara watched them from the doorway for a moment and then found Giovanna, the kitchen supervisor, a woman who had been with the household for 22 years and who wore her loyalty to Elara like a second skin. The ledgers from the Sable room, Elara said quietly. The red ones with the gray binding. Before they get distributed or lost, I want them photographed, every page. Can you manage that without making it obvious? Giovanna looked at her with the steady attention of someone who had been waiting for instructions. When do you need it done? Before 4. Consider it done. Elara touched her arm once, briefly, and moved on. She spent the next 3 hours doing what she had been doing for 15 years without anyone watching, maintaining the infrastructure of an organization that Matteo Vossari ran in name and that she ran in practice. She made 3 phone calls to family representatives who were expecting scheduled callbacks on sensitive matters and who would have noticed and drawn conclusions from a missed connection. She reviewed a security concern that Alessandro had flagged the previous week involving a shipment route through the Port Authority. She approved the salary correction for 2 household employees whose annual reviews had been processed incorrectly in December. She did all of this without urgency, without theater. At 2 in the afternoon, she went to the Donna's suite. The room was empty. Someone had already stripped the bedding and removed the personal photographs from the mantelpiece. Her books were gone from the reading shelf. The small painting she had brought into this house on the day she married Matteo, a landscape by an artist neither famous nor fashionable, just someone whose work she had loved, was gone from the wall, leaving a clean rectangle where the light hadn't faded the paint. She stood in the center of the room and looked at the clean rectangle on the wall for a long time. Then she went to the closet and removed a small travel case from the top shelf, the kind of case you use for a weekend, not for a life. And she began to pack it. The things Elara chose to take were not the things of obvious value. She left the jewelry. She left the clothing that Matteo had selected for her over the years, the evening gowns and the formal pieces that had been chosen because of how they looked beside him at events. She took 3 books, a small notebook she had kept for a decade, a photograph of her mother taken in a city she had not been back to in 20 years, a black cardigan that belonged to no occasion and had no significance except that it was hers, actually hers, purchased with her own money before Matteo's money had become the only money that mattered. She closed the case. Alessandro was waiting in the corridor outside the suite. He had positioned himself there with the careful casualness of a man pretending he happened to be passing through, and they both knew what it meant. "Where will you go?" he asked. "The Meridian, for now." It was a hotel on the other side of the city, discreet and mid-range, the kind of place where people stayed when they wanted not to be noticed. "A few days, then I'll find something more permanent." Alessandro looked at the travel case in her hand. 1 small case, 15 years, 1 small case. "Donna," he said. "Don't," she said quietly. "Please." He nodded, stepped aside. She walked the full length of the corridor and down the main staircase, and the house staff who happened to be visible, and there were more of them visible than would ordinarily be visible at this hour, which was not an accident, stood very still and very straight as she passed, which was not something they had been instructed to do, and was therefore the most honest expression of anything that happened in the Valenti estate that day. She walked out through the front entrance, down the worn stone steps, through the iron gate that swung open as she approached because the gate operator, a man of 60 with a permanent squint, had been watching the monitors and saw her coming and opened it without being asked. The gate closed behind her. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment with the travel case in her hand and the flat white sky still pressing down on everything, and she did not look back at the mansion. She took out her phone and called a car to... In the 2 weeks that followed, Camilla Laurent remade the Valenti estate in her own image, and the image she had was of a place where the old order was simply the past, waiting to be cleared away. She replaced the gate operator with someone younger. She dismissed 2 of the kitchen staff for reasons that were not clearly articulated, but that had something to do with the way they had looked at her during her first week. She brought in a personal security detail that answered to her alone. 3 men who moved around the estate with the displaced aggression of people who had been given authority without being given context for why it mattered. She redid the sitting room on the 2nd floor in a color she described as champagne, which everyone who saw it privately called yellow. Matteo watched these changes with the tolerance of a man who had made a decision and intended to demonstrate his commitment to it by not second-guessing it. He told himself the departures were the natural attrition of a household in transition. He told himself the new security arrangement was modernizing something that had grown complacent. He told himself the yellow sitting room was fine. He told himself a number of things. The first call he couldn't explain away came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Elara left. It was from Renato Saville, who represented one of the 3 families with whom the Valentis had maintained an alliance for over a decade. Renato was a careful man who chose his words with the precision of someone who understood that in their world, the wrong word at the wrong moment had consequences that lasted longer than the conversation. What Renato said was that the scheduled meeting for the following week would need to be postponed, indefinitely, due to matters requiring his attention elsewhere. Matteo said he understood. He put the phone down and looked at the ceiling of the east study for a moment, and then he called Alessandro. Except Alessandro was no longer there. Alessandro had submitted a formal resignation letter 8 days earlier, written in the particular careful language of a man who had served honorably and was leaving honorably and was saying absolutely nothing in the process of doing so. Matteo had accepted the resignation with the grace of a man who had not expected to feel the absence the way he was already beginning to feel it. He called Teo instead. "Get me a list of pending meetings and contacts," Matteo said. "Everything that was being tracked by the household management office." There was a pause that ran a beat too long. "The household management files," Teo said, "were maintained primarily by Donna Elara." "I know." Another pause. "Pull what we have." What they had was incomplete. The scheduling system that Alessandro and Elara's team had maintained was a combination of digital tracking and physical documentation, and the physical documentation saw the ledgers, the contact cards, the correspondence files going back a decade, had not been properly migrated when the Sable room was cleared. Some of it was in boxes in the lower storage level. Some of it may have been moved. Teo was not entirely certain where everything was. Matteo sat with this information. "Find Alessandro," he said. "I need to speak with him." Tug. The meeting happened in a coffee shop near the waterfront, which was not where Matteo Vossari usually conducted his conversations. But Alessandro had suggested it, and Matteo had accepted, which was itself an indication of how the geometry of their relationship had shifted. Alessandro arrived first and was already seated when Matteo walked in, which had never happened before. Matteo sat across from him and a server came and Matteo ordered espresso without looking at the menu, and Alessandro already had tea in front of him, and for a moment they occupied the ordinary sounds of the place. Other people talking, cups on saucers, the particular urban hum of a city that didn't stop for anyone's private reckonings. "Renato Saville postponed," Matteo said. "I know," Alessandro said. "You know, because you still have contacts." "I know because Renato called me personally to ask how Donna Elara was doing. He has a standing arrangement, a private matter that your wife has been managing on behalf of his family for 6 years. He was concerned about the continuity of that arrangement." Matteo looked at him. "What arrangement?" Alessandro looked back at him with the patient expression of a man returning a very obvious question. "There are quite a few of those," he said. "If you'd like me to enumerate them, it will take some time." "Give me the shape of it." Alessandro wrapped both hands around his tea. "Elara has spent the better part of 15 years cultivating relationships with families connected to this organization who required a kind of attention that—" He stopped. chose words carefully, that your particular style of leadership didn't lend itself to. Families with concerns that were personal, ongoing matters involving individuals who needed discretion and continuity from someone they trusted. She was, in effect, a parallel architecture of relationship management that ran alongside the formal organization without ever appearing in any documentation that would have told you it existed. Matteo felt something shift in his chest, a cold movement, like something settling. She never told me the extent of it. You never asked. The espresso arrived and Matteo didn't touch it. Where is she? Alessandro looked at the surface of his tea. She's well, he said. And then, with a precision that bordered on surgical, I don't think I should tell you more than that. Matteo went very still. With respect, Alessandro said, you made your position clear. She made her choice in response to it. What happens next is, that's something you'll need to earn the right to know, Mr. Vasari, not something I'm in a position to simply hand you. Matteo sat with that for a long moment. Outside the window, the waterfront carried its ordinary afternoon traffic. Pedestrians, a cyclist, a delivery truck with its hazards blinking. Normal life, entirely indifferent to the specific disaster unfolding across a small coffee shop table. What do I need to do? Matteo said finally, and his voice was quieter than he intended it to be. Alessandro looked at him for a moment, and something in the older man's face shifted, not softening exactly, but acknowledging. There are people, Alessandro said carefully, who have been waiting to see what you do next. Not to take advantage of the situation, simply to see whether the man who built this house still exists, or whether he's been replaced by something less. And if he still exists, then he has a great deal of work to do, Alessandro said, and very little time to begin it. Matteo paid for the espresso he hadn't touched and stood up and walked back out into the city, and the flat white sky had broken sometime in the afternoon into actual weather, gray and moving, the first real suggestion of a storm. And he stood on the waterfront for a moment with the wind coming off the water, and he understood, with the particular clarity that only comes from a crisis that is entirely of your own making, that he had just been told the most important thing anyone had said to him in years, and he had absolutely no idea yet whether he was capable of doing anything about it. Back at the estate, in the east wing she had chosen for herself, Camilla Laurent was on the phone with someone Matteo didn't know, laughing about something he hadn't been told, and the yellow sitting room glowed at the end of the hall like a warning no one had bothered to translate. The storm that had been threatening all afternoon finally arrived at 11 that night, and it came in hard. Not the kind of storm that builds gradually and gives you time to prepare, but the kind that simply appears, fully formed, as though it had been waiting just past the horizon for exactly the right moment to announce itself. Matteo Vasari stood at the window of the east study and watched the rain hit the courtyard in sheets, and thought about what Alessandro had said, and the longer he thought about it, the colder the room felt, which had nothing to do with the weather. He had been standing there for 40 minutes when Camilla found him. She came in without knocking, which she had started doing recently, and which Matteo had not yet addressed, and she was wearing something silk and carrying a glass of wine she hadn't offered to share, and she said, "You've been in here for hours." "I'm working," he said, without turning from the window. "You're staring at rain." She moved further into the room, her heels on the hardwood, and positioned herself beside his desk in the way she always did when she wanted to have a conversation that was actually an argument in early disguise. "Alessandro called you." He turned then. "How do you know that?" "Teo mentioned you asked him to arrange a meeting." She set the wine glass down on the desk without using a coaster, which was a small thing but landed as a small thing that had been accumulating alongside other small things. "What did the old man want?" "Information," Matteo said. "About what?" He looked at her. In the lamplight of the study, she was still objectively beautiful, still carried the kind of presence that had first caught his attention in a room full of people who were all trying to catch his attention. But there was something about the way she stood in this room, behind his desk, touching his things with the casualness of someone who had already inherited them, that registered now as something he needed to examine. "About what's been happening since the transition," he said carefully. Camilla picked up the wine glass again. "And what did he say was happening?" "He said some of our alliance relationships may have become complicated. Because of me." not a question. Because of the changes. She held the wine glass without drinking from it and looked at him with the steady, slightly tilted attention of someone running a calculation behind a neutral expression. The old man worked for Elara, she said. He was always going to frame whatever he told you in a way that made her absence sound like the source of every problem. He raised specific concerns about specific relationships, which I'm sure he described as irreplaceable and essential and things that only Elara could manage. She set the glass down again. Matteo, these are people who are resistant to change. That's not a crisis. That's friction. Friction is normal when you replace old systems with better ones. What better system? He asked, and his voice was quiet, but the question had edges. Something moved across her face, quick and controlled. A system, she said, where your own house isn't managed by your wife like a separate government within your government. He didn't say anything. She ran things her way, Camilla said, which meant she ran things in a way you didn't have full visibility into. That's not loyalty, that's leverage. Matteo looked at her for a long moment. That's an interesting way to describe 15 years of someone keeping this organization from falling apart. Is that what she told you she was doing? It's what the evidence suggests. The evidence that Alessandro gave you. She picked up the wine glass a third time and finally drank from it, a controlled sip, and then she looked at him over the rim. I'm telling you, Matteo, that man is not your ally. He's hers. He's been hers for 20 years, and he walked out of here the first opportunity he got to send a message. And the message wasn't about your business relationships. The message was about her. Matteo turned back to the window. The rain was heavier now, turning the courtyard lights into blurred smears on the wet stone below. Go to bed, he said. I'll be up later. The silence behind him lasted exactly long enough to communicate that she wasn't satisfied with this, and then he heard her heels on the hardwood again moving toward the door, and the door closing behind her with a sound that was just barely not a slam. He stood at the window for another hour. The first domino fell on a Monday. Matteo had arranged a meeting with 3 of his logistics coordinators, men who handled the movement of significant financial instruments through channels that required continuous maintenance of relationships with Port Authority officials, customs brokers, and a network of intermediaries who did not exist in any formal documentation. It was a meeting that should have been procedural, a check-in, the kind of thing that happened every 8 weeks and lasted 90 minutes and produced nothing dramatic. He sat down at the conference table at 9 in the morning and looked at the 3 men across from him and understood within the first 4 minutes that something was wrong. The oldest of the 3 was a man named Crespo, who had been doing this work for 11 years and who communicated primarily through the precise placement of pauses in his sentences. Crespo set a folder on the table and pushed it across with one finger and said, "The Aldrin route has been suspended." Matteo looked at the folder. "Since when?" "Since the 3rd of last month." "That's..." Matteo did the calculation. "That's 5 weeks ago." "Yes." "Why am I hearing about it now?" Crespo and the man to his left exchanged a look that was not quite a glance. It was slightly too deliberate for a glance. "We reported it through the Household Management Office," Crespo said. "Through the regular channel." "The regular channel?" Matteo repeated. "Yes." Matteo opened the folder. The report was there, date stamped, clearly formatted, flagged for urgent attention. It had a routing mark on the upper corner indicating it had been delivered to the Sable Room Management Office. The Sable Room that had been cleared out 5 weeks ago. The management office that had existed because Elara existed, and that had not, in any functional sense, continued to exist after she left. He closed the folder. He set his hands flat on the table. He said, with a steadiness that cost him something to maintain, "Why has the Aldrin route been suspended?" Crespo's expression was the expression of a man delivering news he'd been carrying for a while. The intermediary, Thomas Weil, passed away 6 weeks ago. He had a standing arrangement with the Donna that covered transition protocols in the event of his death. His replacement was to be contacted through her office within 48 hours and a continuity meeting arranged. That contact was never made. A pause placed with surgical precision. In the absence of contact, Weil's replacement assumed the arrangement had been discontinued and sought other partners. The room was very quiet. What else? Matteo said. Crespo looked at the other two men and then back at Matteo. Would you like the full account now or now? It took 40 minutes. 3 other active channels had experienced similar disruptions, ranging from suspended to functionally terminated. 2 were recoverable with significant effort. 1, involving a relationship that had taken 4 years to develop and that Elara had apparently been the primary cultivator of, was assessed by Crespo as almost certainly not recoverable in the near term. When they were finished, Matteo thanked them and dismissed them and sat alone at the conference table with the folders spread in front of him. He thought about what Camilla had said, about leverage, about visibility. He thought about the fact that the management system Elara had run, the one Camilla had characterized as a parallel government, had apparently been the connective tissue holding operational continuity together across the entire organization, and that he had dismantled it in the time it took to clear out a room. He picked up his phone and called Teo. I need everything we have on the household management files, he said. Everything, including what's in storage. What was in storage was worse than he'd expected, and better than nothing, which in the current situation felt like a very narrow margin to be grateful for. The physical ledgers Elara had maintained were mostly intact. Giovanna's name appeared in the chain of custody documentation, which Matteo filed away as something to think about later. But the relational context that would have given those ledgers meaning was distributed across a decade of correspondence, personal notes, and what appeared to be a separate system of contact management that Elara had maintained independently of any digital infrastructure Matteo's organization used. In other words, the map existed. But the legend required Elara to read it. By Wednesday, Matteo had 2 more postponed meetings on his calendar and a message from a man named Duval, who represented a property partnership that had provided the Valenti organization with certain legally gray but operationally essential financial arrangements for 8 years. Duval's message was polite and brief and said that he was reassessing his professional commitments and would be in touch when his schedule allowed. Matteo showed the message to Camilla. She read it once and handed the phone back. He's testing you, she said. People like Duval pull back to see if you'll chase them. Don't. These aren't games, Matteo said. Everything in this business is a game, she said. The question is who sets the rules. He looked at her for a moment. Something in him wanted to ask her, directly, plainly, the way he had once known how to be direct, whether she understood what was actually at stake, whether she grasped the fact that the relationships she was characterizing as games were the structural load-bearing elements of an organization that had taken 3 generations to build, whether she could distinguish between the performance of confidence and the thing itself. He didn't ask, because he already knew, at some level he hadn't yet allowed himself to fully access, what the answer would be. I'm reaching out to Renato Seville, he said instead. Her eyes sharpened. I thought you already spoke to him. I spoke to his assistant. I'm calling him directly. That signals desperation. That signals respect, Matteo said. There's a difference. She didn't say anything, and the silence was the kind that has a texture to it, and Matteo made the call from the e-study with the door closed. Renato Seville answered on the 3rd ring, which was itself a message. He could have let it go to his assistant. The fact that he picked up meant he was still paying attention, which meant the door was not entirely closed, which meant there was still something to work with. Matteo, Renato said. Renato, I appreciate you taking the call. Of course. A pause. How are things at the estate? The question was casual on its surface and about 12 other things underneath. Transitional, Matteo said. I won't pretend otherwise. No. Another pause. I had a conversation with Elara recently. Matteo went still. He kept his voice even. How is she? She seemed well, settled. Renato's voice carried the particular weight of a man choosing his words with both precision and compassion, a combination that was rarer than it should have been in their world. She asked about my daughter, by name, remembered that Mia had been applying to the architecture program, asked how the admissions process had gone. He let that sit. Elara remembered things like that. She always remembered. Matteo pressed 2 fingers against his forehead. Renato, the postponed meeting. Yes. I'd like to reschedule it. A silence that lasted long enough to have a complete thought inside it. Matteo, Renato said finally, I have a great deal of respect for what your family has built. That respect is for the house as much as the man. At the moment, I'm not entirely certain what the house looks like from where I'm sitting. Tell me what you need to see. I need to see, Renato said slowly, that the decisions being made in that house are being made by someone who understands what the house was built on. Not just the money, not just the territory. Another pause. The people, the relationships, the memory of what has been promised, and by whom, and why it still matters. Matteo was quiet. That kind of memory, Renato said, doesn't live in a file cabinet. The call ended 8 minutes later with a conditional agreement to speak again in 2 weeks, which was better than a closed door and worse than a rescheduled meeting, and Matteo sat in the East study afterward with the phone in his hand, and what Renato had said moved through him slowly, the way something large moves through cold water. That kind of memory doesn't live in a file cabinet. He found Giovanna in the small kitchen behind the pantry at 6 that evening. She was the only original kitchen staff remaining. The others had quietly departed over the past weeks, following Alessandro's lead with the same unhurried determination of people who had decided something and were simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. Giovanna had stayed. Matteo hadn't known until now whether that was loyalty or strategy or simply the practical reality of a woman who hadn't yet figured out her next move. She was at the counter when he came in, and she turned and looked at him without surprise, which told him she'd been expecting this conversation. "Sit down," he said. She sat. He remained standing, which he immediately recognized as a mistake, a posture of authority when what this conversation required was the opposite, and he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down too. "The ledgers," he said. "The red ones with the gray binding." Giovanna looked at him steadily. "Yes." "You photographed them." "I was asked to." "By Elara." "Yes." He nodded slowly. "I'm not going to make this difficult for you," he said. "I need you to understand that." "Mr. Vasari," Giovanna said, with the careful directness of a woman who had nothing left to lose in this particular dynamic. "I've worked in this house for 22 years. I've watched 3 different versions of it, and I know what it looks like when a house is in trouble." She folded her hands on the table. "What do you want to know?" "I want to know how to reach her." Giovanna was quiet for a moment. Her hands stayed folded. "She's not hiding," she said finally. "She didn't leave to punish you or to make herself difficult to find. She left because you made it clear she wasn't wanted here." A pause. "The question isn't whether you can find her. The question is what you're going to say when you do." Matteo looked at the surface of the table. "I'm trying to figure that out." "I know." Giovanna unfolded her hands. "She's at a place called the Finch apartment building on Darrow Street. She's been there for 3 weeks. She goes to the same coffee place every morning at 7:30. She stood up. "But Mr. Vasari, if you go there before you've figured out what you're going to say, you'll make it worse. She's not going to accept an apology that's really a request." He sat with that after she left. The small kitchen was very quiet. Outside the narrow window above the counter, the courtyard was wet from the previous days of rain, and the overhead light reflected off the standing water in the stone joints, and the mansion felt, for the first time in a way he was willing to let himself acknowledge, enormous and hollow. He didn't go to Darrow Street the next morning. He went to find Marco Vela instead, which was a decision that had been forming at the back of his mind since Alessandro's coffee shop meeting, and that he'd been avoiding because Marco Vela had a way of saying true things in a way that felt like an autopsy being performed on a patient who was still technically alive. Marco was 68 years old and had served as the senior advisor to the Valenti family council for 14 years. He was not a man who held operational power. He was a man who held the kind of power that operational power depended on for its legitimacy, which was a more durable kind. He lived in a townhouse on the north side of the city, and he answered the door himself when Matteo knocked, which meant he'd been expecting the visit. They sat in the front room with coffee, neither of them touched, and Marco listened to Matteo lay out the situation with the concentrated attention of a man doing a diagnosis. When Matteo finished, Marco was quiet for a moment. Then he said, How long did you think it would take before things started coming apart? I didn't think that's the answer, Marco said. He wasn't unkind about it. He delivered it with the measured finality of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask the right question. You made a decision without accounting for the infrastructure. You can replace a person. You can't replace what a person built over 15 years without rebuilding it over 15 years. There's no shortcut. What does the council think? Matteo asked. Marco looked at him with the particular patience of a man who is about to say something significant and wants to make sure the listener is fully present for it. The council, he said, is having a conversation. About what? About confidence, Marco said, in the leadership of this house. Matteo went very still. Not hostile, Marco said quickly. Nobody is moving against you. Nobody wants that. But there are people with long memories who remember that this organization has survived because of a particular combination of strength and wisdom, and they are looking at the current situation and asking whether that combination is still present. And what are you telling them? Marco picked up his coffee cup and held it without drinking. I'm telling them to give you time to demonstrate it. He set the cup down. But Matteo, the time is not unlimited, and the things that need to happen, the relationships that need to be repaired, the trust that needs to be restored, those things cannot be accomplished by you alone. Not because you're not capable, but because the relationships in question are not yours. They were never yours. He met Matteo's eyes. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Matteo understood. He drove back to the estate in the late afternoon with the city moving around him and the understanding sitting in his chest like a stone. The council was watching. Renato Saville was watching. The people who had built their trust in the Valenti name over decades were watching, and what they were watching for was whether Matteo would do the thing that he most did not want to do, which was to admit, publicly, materially, in ways that could not be walked back, that he had been wrong. He was still sitting with this when he turned onto the estate road and saw the vehicles parked outside the front gate. 3 black cars, unfamiliar plates. 2 men standing outside them who straightened when they saw his headlights. And at the gate itself, visible through the bars, Camilla's new security detail positioned with a formality that they hadn't been using before, which meant someone had told them to present themselves differently tonight. Matteo got out of his car and looked at the unfamiliar vehicles. Who's here? He asked the closest member of his own security. The man glanced toward the house with an expression that was carefully managed. Miss Laurent has guests, he said. They arrived about an hour ago. What guests? 3 men. She received them personally. They went to the second-floor reception room. Matteo looked at the yellow light in the second-floor window. He felt something move through him. Not quite anger, not quite fear. Something in the middle that had the quality of a door closing. Get me a name, he said. His security man was on his radio for 90 seconds. Then he came back and said, The vehicles are registered to a holding company called Ardent Partners. Miss Laurent has mentioned this name before in... I know the name, Matteo said. He did know the name. He knew it because Ardent Partners had been introduced to him by Camilla 4 months ago as a potential investment contact. People she knew, people she trusted, people who she said had expressed interest in certain opportunities within his organization. He had not moved forward with them at the time because something about the introduction had felt slightly wrong in a way he hadn't been able to precisely articulate. Now Camilla was entertaining them in his house, in his reception room, without telling him they were coming. He walked through the front gate and up the worn stone steps and into the mansion, and his footsteps on the marble floor of the entrance hall were the only sound for a moment. And then he heard voices from the second floor. Camilla's voice, and 2 men's voices, too low and too distant to make out words. And he stood at the bottom of the staircase and listened and understood. With the cold precision of a man who has made too many mistakes in too short a time to afford the luxury of uncertainty, that the woman he had brought into this house was not the person he had believed her to be, and that the damage that had been done to his organization, to his alliances, to the one relationship that had been the actual foundation of everything he had spent his life building, was now accelerating toward a point from which there might be no recovery at all. He started up the stairs, and behind him the front door was still open, and the night air came through it cold and indifferent, and somewhere in the city on Darrow Street, in a modest apartment in a building called the Finch, a woman who had built this empire and walked away from it in a single small suitcase was sleeping without him, and the distance between where she was and where he stood at the top of those stairs was not measured in city blocks. It was measured in every choice he had made since the morning he decided that loyalty was something you could simply swap out for something better, and discovered too late and at enormous cost that you cannot swap out the foundation of a house and expect the walls to hold. He opened the door to the second-floor reception room and stepped inside, and the three people who turned to look at him were not, in that moment, particularly surprised to see him, which was the most frightening thing of all. The three people who turned to look at him were not surprised, and that was the thing that landed first. Not what they were doing there, not who they were, not the presence of Camila standing near the window with a glass of wine that was clearly not her first. The absence of surprise. They had known he would come through that door, which meant they had planned for it, which meant everything that had appeared spontaneous about this evening had been constructed in advance. Matteo stood in the doorway and did the arithmetic in about 4 seconds. Two men he didn't recognize seated on the near couch, both of them in the particular kind of expensive neutral clothing that was designed to communicate nothing while communicating significant resources. One of them was maybe 45 with the compact stillness of someone accustomed to high-stakes rooms. The other was younger, had a tablet on his knee, and was the only one of the three who looked even slightly uncomfortable. Camilla set her wine glass down on the side table with a sound that was too deliberate to be casual. "Matteo," she said, "I was going to call you." "Were you?" he said. He didn't move from the doorway. "This isn't what—" She stopped. Recalibrated. In 6 months, he had watched her do that recalibration maybe a dozen times, the micro-adjustment between what she'd started to say and what she'd decided would land better, and every time he'd told himself it was just the way quick-minded people spoke. Now he saw it differently. "I wanted to introduce you in a more... This wasn't how I imagined doing this." "Then explain how you did imagine doing it," Matteo said, "and we can work backward from there." The older of the two men stood up. He extended a hand with the confident unhurriedness of someone who was used to being the authority in any room he entered. "Mr. Vosari, my name is Harlan Voss. I've been looking forward to speaking with you directly." Matteo looked at the extended hand. He did not take it. "Sit down," he said. Harlan Voss held the extended hand for a half-second longer than dignity allowed, then sat back down. The younger man with the tablet shifted in his seat. Matteo walked into the room and chose the chair that put his back to the wall, and all three of them in his sightline, which was a habit so deeply installed it was no longer a decision. He sat down and looked at Harlan Voss and said, "Ardent Partners." "That's right. Investment group. Among other things." "What other things?" Voss looked briefly at Camilla, who gave him a small nod that she clearly didn't realize Matteo could see from his angle in the room. The nod of someone giving permission. It hit Matteo in the sternum like a flat object. "Mr. Vosari," Voss said, "the Valenti organization is at a transitional moment. That's not a criticism. It's an observation shared by a number of people who have significant respect for what your family has built. We represent a group of investors who believe there is an opportunity in this transition to—" "To what?" Matteo said. Voss paused at the interruption. "To restructure certain operational elements in ways that would modernize the organization and significantly increase its financial output." "Restructure meaning what?" "Meaning," Voss said, with the patience of a man who had prepared for resistance and was not particularly troubled by it, that certain legacy arrangements which have been maintained out of tradition rather than profitability could be dissolved. Certain relationships which no longer serve the organization's core interests could be renegotiated or terminated. And certain decision-making processes which are currently concentrated in ways that create single points of failure could be distributed more efficiently. Matteo looked at him. The room was very quiet. "Say that again, in plain language." "We would like to acquire a controlling interest in the operational infrastructure of the Valenti organization," Voss said, and the patience in his voice had given way to something flatter and more direct. "In exchange for significant capital injection and the resolution of several of your current liquidity concerns." The word liquidity dropped into the room like something dropped from a height. Matteo turned his head slowly and looked at Camilla. She was still standing near the window. Her posture had the careful arrangement of someone who was performing stillness because they did not trust what their body would do if they stopped performing it. Her eyes met his and held, which he gave her credit for, because it would have been easier and smarter to look away. "You told them about the liquidity concerns," he said. "Matteo, that information exists in maybe 4 documents, none of which you had access to through any legitimate channel. I was trying to help. You told strangers about internal financial vulnerabilities in my organization." His voice was very quiet, which in his experience was always more effective than loudness, and also less controllable once it started. He was controlling it now. "Sit down, Camilla." She sat. He looked back at Voss. "How long has she been talking to you?" Voss glanced at Camilla again, and this time she didn't give him the nod. She was staring at the floor. And Voss made the calculation about whose interests he was currently better served by, and turned back to Matteo with the expression of a man choosing his short-term survival. "Approximately 8 months," he said. 8 months. Matteo placed the timeline. 8 months ago, he and Camilla had been together for 2 months. He had not yet made the decision about Elara. He had not yet dismantled the household management office, or removed Elara's photographs, or said the words, "I want Camilla to have the Donna's suite in the East Study on a flat white morning while the heating system hissed through the walls." He had not yet done any of it, which meant the sequence was not what he had believed it was. He had believed that he had made a choice, and Camilla had arrived as a consequence of that choice. But the timeline said something else. The timeline said he had been a choice that someone else had made, and had then been managed toward a conclusion that had been determined before he understood there was a game being played. He sat with this for a moment. It was the kind of realization that requires a moment, regardless of what else is happening in the room. "Get out," he said to Voss. Voss began to say something about the parameters of the offer. "If you are still in this building in 4 minutes," Matteo said, without raising his voice, "the men who escort you out will not be gentle about it." Voss and the younger man gathered themselves and left with the controlled efficiency of people who were cutting their losses and recalculating from a safe distance. The door closed behind them. The room was suddenly very different, with only 2 people in it. Camilla hadn't moved. Matteo looked at her across the space of the yellow sitting room, the color she had chosen in the house she had maneuvered herself into, with the plan she had been running since before he knew her name. And he felt something that surprised him with its temperature. Not rage. Rage would have been easier. What he felt was colder than rage and more precise, and it had the particular quality of a man who has just understood that the most significant damage done to him was not done by an enemy. It was done by himself. "How much of it was real?" he said. She looked up. Her eyes were dry, which was telling. Women who were frightened cried, or at least produced the precursor expressions of someone who might cry. Camilla looked at him with a clarity that was almost admirable. "More than you think," she said. "That's not an answer. I had feelings for you." She said it flatly, not defensively. "That part was real. It complicated things, actually. Made it harder to—" She stopped. "To run the play," he said. She didn't deny it. "Voss approaches you when," Matteo said. "Before we met, he had been tracking the organization for a while. He knew there were—" She paused, choosing her word, "tensions. In your marriage. He thought there might be a natural entry point. And you were the entry point. I was supposed to get close, get information on the financial structure and the alliance relationships. Give them a picture of the vulnerabilities." She held her hands in her lap with a stillness that was effortful. "I wasn't supposed to—" She stopped again. "You weren't supposed to what?" "I wasn't supposed to actually care how it ended for you," she said. And for the first time in the conversation, there was something in her voice that sounded like something other than managed performance, a roughness at the edge of it, and Matteo looked at her and couldn't determine whether that was real or the last layer of the thing. "I told Voss 3 months ago that I wanted out. He told me it was too late. Because you already knew enough that they couldn't let you walk away." "Yes," Matteo stood up. He moved to the window where she had been standing and looked out at the courtyard below, wet stone and reflected light, and his own reflection ghosted in the glass back at him. A large man, tired, with the expression of someone who had just had the floor of his understanding removed and was still in the falling part, not yet the landing. "Elara," he said, not to Camilla, almost to himself. "What about her?" He turned. Was she part of what they were trying to map? The alliance relationships, the contacts she maintained. Was that what Voss needed the picture of? Camilla looked at the floor, which was its own answer. They wanted to know which relationships went through her, Matteo said slowly. Not which relationships were mine, which ones were hers, the ones that couldn't be accessed through the formal organization. He felt the architecture of it assembling itself in his chest with a sickening precision, because those were the ones worth acquiring or destroying. He crossed the room in 4 steps, and he was in front of her before she had time to register that he was moving, and he leaned down and said, very quietly, directly, "Did you give them her contacts?" Camilla looked up at him. Her jaw was set. "Some," she said. "Not all. I stopped before—" He straightened up, stepped back. He needed the distance, not because he was going to hurt her, but because the room was not large enough for what he was feeling, and he needed to put space between himself and something he couldn't physically move away from. He called his security chief. "Get her things packed," he said into the phone. "She leaves tonight. Full escort off the property. No conversation. No delay." He looked at Camilla while he said it, and she looked back at him, and when he ended the call, she said, "Matteo, I'm sorry." "Don't," he said. "Don't finish that." He left her in the yellow room and walked to the east study and closed the door and stood at the window for the 3rd night in a row, and the rain had stopped, but the courtyard was still wet, and the reflected light still blurred in the standing water, and he picked up his phone and called Marco Vela. Marco answered on the 2nd ring. It was 10:45 at night. "I need to tell you something," Matteo said. "I'm listening," Marco said, and something in the old man's voice suggested he had also been waiting. Matteo told him, all of it, Voss, Ardent Partners, the 8-month timeline, the information that had been extracted, the alliance contacts that may have been compromised. He spoke for 11 minutes without interruption, and when he was done, there was a silence on Marco's end that had a quality of something being measured. "The council needs to know," Marco said finally. "I know. Tonight, Matteo, not tomorrow." "I know." He pressed the heel of his hand against his eye socket. "Marco, the contacts that were potentially given to them, Elara's contacts, we need to—" "She needs to be told," Marco said, "before we do anything else. If her name has been compromised in those circles, she needs to know so she can protect herself." "I know." "You need to go to her tonight." He didn't say anything. "Matteo." Marco's voice was not unkind. "I understand what that costs you. Go anyway." Darrow Street. At 11:15 at night was quiet, in the way that mid-range residential streets are quiet. Not empty, but settled into itself. The particular calm of a neighborhood that contained ordinary lives being lived with reasonable dignity. The Finch apartment building was 5 stories of brick and narrow windows. The kind of building that had been functional and unglamorous for 40 years and intended to remain so. Matteo sat in the car outside it for 3 minutes. Then he got out and went to the intercom panel and found the name, E. Varelli, apartment 4C, her own name, not his, and he pressed the button and waited. The intercom crackled. "Yes?" Her voice low and alert, not the voice of someone who had been asleep. "It's me," he said. A silence that lasted long enough for the ambient sounds of the street to fill it. A distant car, the mechanical click of a traffic light changing at the corner, the specific urban quiet of a city that never fully stopped but did slow down. "I know it's late," he said. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't urgent." Another silence. Then the door buzzed open. She was standing in the doorway of 4C when he came off the elevator, and she was dressed, not as if she'd been awake and working, but not as if he'd pulled her from sleep. She was in dark slacks and a cardigan that he recognized. the plain black one she'd taken from the mansion in her single small suitcase. And she looked at him the way she'd always looked at him when something serious was happening, with her full attention, completely still, without the social reflexes that other people deployed to fill the space between knowing something was wrong and being told what it was. "Come in," she said. The apartment was small and orderly, almost spare, but it had the feeling of a place that had been made habitable by specific choices rather than default. There were books on a shelf that she had clearly organized herself, a lamp in the corner that gave the room a warm and deliberate light. The small landscape painting from the Donna's suite hung above the writing desk, the one she'd loved for no fashionable reason. He looked at it for a moment. She saw him looking. "Sit down, Matteo," she said. He sat. She remained standing, which he noted without comment, because standing was where she kept her options open, and he understood that. He told her. He was direct and he was thorough, and he did not soften the parts that required him to acknowledge his own culpability, which was most of it. He told her about Voss and the 8-month timeline. He told her that Camilla had been placed in his path as a mechanism for access. He told her that some of her contacts, the private relationships she'd maintained, the ones no formal document recorded, may have been extracted and passed to people who had no right to them. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long time. "Which contacts?" she said. "Do you know specifically?" "Not yet. I need to." She went to the writing desk and opened the center drawer and removed a small notebook. Not the one she'd brought from the mansion, a different one, newer. And she opened it and looked at it for a moment, and then she said, "Renato's family arrangement." "Likely. The Holt situation." "Probably." "Dara Sessoms." Something went cold in Matteo's chest. He knew that name. Dara Sessoms was a woman connected to the Meridian family, one of the oldest alliances the Valentis had, and her particular situation, the nature of the private arrangement Elara had maintained on her behalf, was not something that could be exposed without consequences that would extend well beyond any financial damage. "If they have Dara's information," Elara said, not looking up from the notebook, "they can use it to destroy the Meridian alliance entirely, or extort the Meridian family, or both." She closed the notebook. "How much did Camilla actually know about Dara?" "I don't know." "You need to find out, tonight. Camilla is being removed from the estate as we speak." "That doesn't help if she already passed what she knew." Elara looked at him then, directly, with the full attention gaze that had no social lubrication in it, just assessment. "You need to talk to her before she leaves the property. Not your security. You." He had not expected this. He had expected something else, anger, or the controlled expression of it that was more cutting than the open version. He had not expected her to immediately begin solving the problem. "Elara." "Matteo." She set the notebook down on the desk. "There are people connected to me who may be in danger because of choices made in my house. We can deal with what happened between us afterward. Right now, I need you to go back there and find out exactly what was given to Voss before Camilla disappears and we lose the chance to know." He looked at her. The lamp in the corner lit one side of her face and left the other in shadow, and she looked different than she'd looked in the mansion. Not diminished, not bereft, more concentrated somehow, like something had been removed that had been absorbing light meant for her. "Will you come back to the estate?" he said. "No," she said, immediately and without cruelty. "Not tonight. Not for that reason. I mean to help manage. I know what you mean." She picked up her phone from the desk. "I'll work from here. I have what I need. You go back and find out about Dara." She looked at him once more before she dialed. "Matteo, the council meeting Marco calls. Whatever they decide, accept it. Whatever they require from you. Don't negotiate. Don't manage it. Just accept it." "Why?" "Because it's the only thing that has a chance of working," she said, and she turned slightly away from him and put the phone to her ear. And the conversation was over in the way that conversations with Elara had always been over. Not with a door slamming, but with a direction given, clearly and without drama, after which there was simply the question of whether you were going to follow it. He went back down in the elevator and out through the Finch building's glass door and onto Darrow Street. And the night air was cold and the street was still quiet. And he called his driver and stood on the sidewalk waiting and felt, For the first time in months, the precise dimensions of what he'd dismantled. Not the relationships, not the alliances, not the operational infrastructure that was currently coming apart at the seams. The person. The specific, irreplaceable person who had just sent him back to do the hard thing with a clarity and a lack of self-pity that he was not sure he deserved to be the recipient of. He got in the car. He called Camilla's cell before the car reached the end of the block. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been holding the phone. "Dara Sesams," he said. What did you give Voss?" A silence. Then, "How do you know that name?" "Answer the question." Another silence, longer, with a different quality. The quality of someone deciding whether the calculation still held. "I gave him a contact name and a general description of the arrangement," she said finally. "Not the details." "What contact name?" "A woman called Petra. She was the liaison." Matteo closed his eyes. Petra was the name nobody outside of a closed circle of 4 people was supposed to know. If Voss had Petra's name, he could find Petra, and if he found Petra, he had everything. "Did he make contact with her?" Matteo said. "I don't know," Camilla said. "Matteo, I genuinely don't know. I gave him the name 2 months ago, and I don't know what he did with it." He ended the call. He called Elara back and said, "Petra?" A brief silence. Then, "I'll handle it." "How fast?" "Faster than you can," she said, and she was already gone. The car moved through the nighttime city, and Matteo sat in the back of it with the window down despite the cold and thought about the council meeting that was coming, and the accounting it would require of him, and the things he would have to say out loud in front of men who had watched him build what he'd built, and were now watching him account for how much of it he'd burned. And underneath all of that, persistent and undeniable, the understanding that had been assembling itself since the moment Voss said 8 months. He had not lost his empire because Camilla had taken something from him. He had lost it because he had handed her the door and pointed to the lock and walked away believing that the house would hold without the person who had actually been holding it. The driver turned onto the estate road. The yellow light in the second-floor window was dark now. Camilla's things were being moved. Her security detail was already pulling their vehicles out through the south gate. The mansion sat at the end of the drive in the cold and the dark, and it looked exactly the way it was, enormous and empty, and waiting for someone to decide what it was going to be. Matteo got out of the car and stood looking at it, and what he understood in that moment, fully, without negotiation, without any remaining capacity to soften it, was that the only path back to anything worth saving required him to walk into that council meeting and say in plain language that he had been wrong, that he had been used, that the most significant vulnerability in his organization had not been Elara's independent management structure, or the opacity of her relationship network, or any of the things he had been told to resent. The vulnerability had been his willingness to believe that what someone had built over 15 years of quiet and unrewarded work could be replaced by a face he'd found attractive and strategically placed directly in his path. He walked up the worn stone steps and through the front entrance, and the mansion received him in silence. And for the first time since Elara had walked out through these same doors with one small suitcase in her hand, Matteo Vossari did not feel like the most powerful man in the building. He felt like what he actually was, a man standing in the wreckage of his own judgment, with a council meeting coming at dawn and no version of the truth available to him that didn't begin with the words, "I was wrong," and end with the question of whether wrong, acknowledged fully and without excuse, was still something a man could come back from. He didn't know the answer, but for the first time in months, he understood that not knowing it was the most honest thing about him, and that honesty, raw and costly and arrived at far too late, was the only currency he had left to spend. The council meeting was called for 6 in the morning, which was Marco Vela's way of ensuring that only the people who were serious about being there would be there. Serious people got up at 5 and drove through a city that wasn't fully awake yet, and arrived without coffee and sat in uncomfortable chairs and dealt with hard things before the rest of the world had finished its first hour. People who weren't serious found reasons not to come. 7 men came. They gathered in the formal meeting room on the ground floor of Marco's townhouse, a room that had no recording equipment and no windows facing the street, and a table that was old enough to have witnessed versions of this conversation before. Matteo arrived last, which was deliberate. Not to make an entrance, but because he had been on the phone with Elara until 4:30, managing the Petra situation. And when he walked in and sat down at the table, he had not slept, and it showed in every line of his face, and he did not attempt to hide it. Marco opened without preamble. "We're here because Matteo requested it. I'll let him speak first." Matteo looked at the 6 men across the table. He knew all of them. He had known some of them for 20 years. He had made money with them and navigated crises with them and attended their children's events and called them when things went wrong. And now he was going to sit at this table and tell them that the thing that had gone wrong this time was him. He put his hands flat on the table and he talked for 22 minutes. He told them about Ardent Partners and Harlan Voss. He told them about the 8-month timeline and what it meant about the sequence of events he had believed was his own decision-making. He told them about the information that had been extracted, the alliance contacts, the financial vulnerabilities, the name Petra, and what that name could be used to do to the Meridian family arrangement if Voss got there before they did. He told them about the contacts Elara had been maintaining and how they had been mapped without his knowledge and used as a targeting document by people whose interest in the Valenti organization was not partnership but acquisition. He did not editorialize. He did not manage the impression he was making. He said what had happened in the order it had happened, and when he was done, he said, "I made the decisions that created the access point. Nobody forced them. I'm telling you this because you need the full picture to decide what happens next, and because you deserve it." The room was quiet for a moment. Then a man named Ferrante, who was 64 years old and had the permanent expression of someone biting down on something bitter, said, "How much does Voss actually have?" "Enough to be dangerous, not everything." "What stopped him from getting everything?" Matteo paused for exactly 1 beat. "Elara," he said. She identified the exposure points before Voss could act on the contact information he'd been given. "She's been working through the night to close them." Ferrante looked at the table. "She's still doing work for this organization." "She's protecting people she built relationships with," Matteo said. "That's not the same thing. She's not doing it for the organization. She's doing it because she gives a damn about the individuals involved." Another silence. This one had a different texture. Not hostile, not forgiving, just the particular quality of men who were processing the gap between what they'd understood the situation to be and what it actually was. A man named Bryce, younger than the others, lean and precise, said, "What do you need from us?" "3 things, Matteo said. "Authorization to move against Ardent Partners' access points. We have 2 identified financial channels they were planning to use to formalize an acquisition play, and I want them closed before the end of the day. Second, a direct communication to the Meridian family from this council, not from me, establishing that the Petra situation is being handled and that the alliance is intact. Third," he stopped. "Third, I need to know if this council still recognizes my position." The room absorbed that. Marco said, "Is there a reason it shouldn't?" "I handed an infiltration asset the keys to this house," Matteo said flatly. "I dismantled the management structure that would have caught it. I ignored every signal that something was wrong because I was too committed to a decision I'd already made to examine it. Give me a reason it should." Marco looked at the 6 other men around the table. Some kind of wordless communication passed through the room, the kind that happens between people who have known each other long enough to conduct entire conversations with their eyes. "The ardent channels," Ferrante said. "You can close them yourself." "Yes. Do it today." He looked at Matteo with the expression of a man who has decided something and is in the process of delivering it. "The council will send the Meridian communication. As for your position," a pause, "you'll keep it, on the condition that every decision involving the structural relationships of this organization goes through this table for the next 12 months. Nothing unilateral." Matteo said, "Agreed." "And Matteo," Ferrante leaned forward slightly, "bring Elara back in. Whatever that requires. Figure it out." Matteo didn't say anything. "I'm not telling you how to run your marriage," Ferrante said. "I'm telling you that this organization has a structural dependency that we cannot replace with any amount of capital or new personnel, and that dependency has a name, and her name is Elara Varelli, and she is currently sitting in an apartment on Darrow Street doing work that protects people in this room out of personal loyalty to them, not to you, which frankly says everything that needs to be said about where the actual value in your house has always resided. He leaned back. The room was very quiet. Matteo looked at the table. I know, he said. So he was out of Marco's townhouse by 7:15 and on the phone by 7:16. Not to Elara. To his own financial team because the Ardent channels needed to move first. If Voss understood that the council meeting had happened and that Matteo was moving to close the access points, there was a window of maybe 4 hours before Voss shifted to a contingency plan. And contingency plans for men like Harlan Voss tended to be more aggressive than primary plans because they were built for situations where subtlety had already failed. His financial director, a woman named Suki, who had been with the Valenti organization for 9 years, and who operated with the imperturbable efficiency of someone who had seen enough crises to have developed a personal taxonomy for them, took his call on the first ring. Ardent Partners, he said to 2 channels. I'm sending you the account identifiers in the next 10 minutes. I need them frozen before noon. What are we calling this? Suki said, meaning what legal mechanism? Fraudulent misrepresentation in a proposed acquisition. I'll have documentation from last night that establishes their agent made material misrepresentations to gain access to proprietary financial information. Their agent being Camilla Laurent. A brief pause. I'll need her to cooperate. She will. He said it with a certainty he was mostly sure he could back up. Then I can have the filing in before 10 and the freeze by noon. Another pause, shorter. Mr. Vossari, there's something you should know before you move on the channels. He waited. Ardent Partners filed a preliminary acquisition interest document 3 weeks ago, Suki said. With the regulatory body. It's not public yet. It's in a pre-disclosure holding period. But it exists. They were further along than you knew. He stopped walking. He was on the sidewalk outside Marco's townhouse, halfway to his car, and he stopped with his hand on the door handle and felt the city moving around him. How far along? Far enough that a channel freeze creates a public record of a disputed acquisition, Suki said carefully, which means it stops being a private matter. Press will pick it up within 24 hours of the filing. Matteo stood there with his hand on the car door and worked through the implications. A public record of a disputed acquisition meant public visibility into the fact that the Valenti organization had been penetrated. It meant questions about how. It meant the story of Camilla Laurent became not a private humiliation, but a documented event with a paper trail. And a paper trail meant that every alliance partner, every family connection, every relationship Elara had maintained in careful and private confidence for 15 years would be reading about the vulnerabilities of this organization in whatever outlet picked up the story first. Is there a way to move on the channels without triggering the public record? He said. Not through the legal mechanism you described, Suki said. There might be another way, but I'd need to talk to Elara. He almost asked why. He stopped himself because he already knew why. Because Elara knew the regulatory contacts. Elara knew the people. Elara knew which conversations happened off the record and which relationships made the off-record conversations possible. I'll call you back, he said. He got in the car and he called Elara. She answered immediately, which meant she hadn't slept either. Petra is handled, she said before he could speak. She's been moved and her contact information has been changed across every channel Camilla could have accessed. Voss has a name that no longer leads anywhere. That's... He exhaled. Good. That's good. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead. There's something else. He told her about the pre-disclosure filing. He told her about the public record problem. He listened to her silence on the other end of the line and heard it the way he'd learned to hear her silences over 15 years. Not as absence, but as active processing, the sound of a very precise mind moving through a problem at speed. Suki needs to talk to you, he said. I know. A pause. Send me the filing details. I need to see the document before I talk to anyone. Elara. The document first, Matteo. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge of exhaustion under it, the first crack in the composure she'd been maintaining through a night that had asked a great deal of it. Then I'll talk to Suki. Then we'll figure out whether there's a path that doesn't end up in the papers. He sent her the document. He drove. Harlan Voss called at 9:47. Matteo had been expecting it since 7. The fact that it took until nearly 10 meant that Voss had spent the morning hours doing his own accounting and had arrived at a calculation that required a direct conversation. Men like Voss didn't make unnecessary calls. They called when they needed something or when they wanted you to know they had something, and the line between those two things was where negotiations happened. Matteo answered, "I heard there was a meeting this morning," Voss said. No greeting, no preamble. "You heard fast." "I pay attention." A pause. "I want to be clear that Arden's position doesn't change based on the outcome of internal conversations. The filing is in place. The timeline proceeds." "The timeline," Matteo said, "is about to have a problem." Is it? "We're moving to contest the acquisition interest on the basis of fraudulent inducement. We have documentation, we have a witness, and we have a regulatory contact who takes a particular interest in cases where proprietary financial information is obtained through personal manipulation." He kept his voice even and almost bored, which was a register he had learned from watching Elara handle difficult conversations for 15 years. The register that communicated that the outcome was already known, and this phone call was just the courtesy notification. "You want to withdraw the filing before noon, or you want to be the respondent in a proceeding that gets picked up by 3 financial journalists I'm going to personally call this afternoon." Silence. "Camilla Laurent," Voss said, "is not a reliable witness." "She doesn't need to be reliable. She just needs to be documented. And she is." A pause. "Withdraw the filing, Harlan. Take your people and go work on someone else's house." The silence this time lasted long enough that Matteo could hear the ambient sound of wherever Voss was. A hotel room, the particular quality of air conditioning, and distant traffic that belonged to a man who had been in the city temporarily and had not planned to leave yet. "This isn't finished," Voss said. "Yes, it is," Matteo said. "You just haven't processed it yet." He ended the call. His hands were not entirely steady when he set the phone down, which he acknowledged privately and aloud because steadiness was a performance, and he was alone in the car and there was no one to perform it for. His phone rang again 40 seconds later. Not Voss. Elara. "I found a path," she said. "Suki and I can move through a private arbitration mechanism that doesn't generate a public record. It requires the filing to be withdrawn voluntarily. If Voss pulls it, we can contest the access to our financial information through arbitration, and it stays sealed." "He's going to withdraw," Matteo said. "I just spoke to him." A pause. "You're sure?" "He doesn't have enough. He had a play, and the play depended on Camilla having access she no longer has, and on me being isolated enough that the council wouldn't move. Neither of those things is true anymore." Another pause, slightly longer. "Okay," she said, and then with a quietness that had something exhausted and human at the bottom of it. "Okay. Then call Suki and tell her to be ready to move into arbitration the moment the withdrawal comes through." Elara. He said her name and then didn't immediately say what came after it, because what came after it was something he had been not saying for weeks, in the justified belief that he hadn't yet earned the right to say it. "Not now, Matteo," she said quietly. I know what you want to say." Her voice was not cold. It was careful. The voice of someone who understood the value of what was being offered and also understood that value and timing were not the same thing. "Let today finish first." He let today finish. Oops. The withdrawal came through at 11:53. 7 minutes before Suki's noon deadline, which Matteo chose to read as Voss being precise rather than as Voss being cooperative, because the distinction mattered for understanding what kind of threat he remained going forward. By 2 in the afternoon, the arbitration filing was in place, and the financial channels were sealed through a mechanism that would not generate a public record. By 3, Marco Vela had sent the Meridian family communication and received an acknowledgement that was formal but not hostile, which in the language of that particular relationship meant that the damage was real but not terminal. By 4, Matteo was sitting in the east study of the Valenti estate in a house that felt different than it had felt 24 hours ago. Not better, exactly, but more honest. Like a room after a window has been opened, colder but clearer. He had been sitting there for about 20 minutes when Teo knocked and came in with the expression of a man carrying information he wasn't certain how to deliver. "There's someone at the gate," Teo said. Matteo looked up. "Who?" "Alessandro Ran." Teo paused. "He has 3 other people with him. The kitchen supervisor, 2 of the former security team." Matteo was quiet for a moment. He looked at the surface of the desk. He thought about what had brought Alessandro to this gate on this particular afternoon, and the only answer that made sense was that Alessandro had heard, through whatever channel of information operated in the world these people moved through, that something had shifted, that the thing he had resigned in protest of was no longer the thing that defined the house, or that someone had called him. "Open the gate," Matteo said. Alessandro came in through the front entrance, and Matteo met him in the main corridor, and the 2 men stood there for a moment in the way that men stand when they have said difficult things to each other, and the difficult things have not been forgotten, but the reason for them may have changed. "I heard there was a council meeting," Alessandro said. "There was. And that the situation with Miss Laurent has been resolved." "It has." Alessandro looked at him with the measured assessment of a man who had spent 40 years reading rooms. "And the organization?" "Damaged," Matteo said. "Not destroyed. We're working on the damage." "We," Alessandro said. Not a challenge, a question about who was included in the word. Matteo said, "Elara is—" He stopped. He started again. "She helped manage the immediate crisis. She's not back. That's a different conversation that I haven't earned yet." Alessandro nodded once, slowly. "The household needs managing," he said. "In the practical sense, there are things that have been neglected." "I know." "I'm not making a permanent commitment," Alessandro said carefully. "I'm saying that a house in the process of being repaired still needs someone to keep the lights on." Matteo looked at him. He felt something that was not quite relief and not quite gratitude, something older than both, the particular feeling of a man who has been alone in a problem and is no longer alone in it. "Can you start today?" he said. "I already have," Alessandro said, and he moved past Matteo down the corridor with the efficient purposefulness of a man returning to work he understood, and behind him the 3 others followed, and the house received them with the specific quality of a space that has been empty long enough to know the difference. Matteo stood in the corridor and listened to the sound of the house filling again. Footsteps, a door, the distant sound of the kitchen coming back to life, and he understood that this was not the ending. This was the part just before the ending, which was both harder and more important, because it required him to do something he had spent his entire life avoiding, to go to the person he had wronged, not with an explanation, not with a defense, not with the implicit offer of the empire as compensation for the damage done to her, but with nothing. Just himself and the accounting and the question of whether the man he was capable of becoming was someone she was willing to know. He picked up his phone and looked at Elara's name and his contacts for a long moment. Then he set the phone down. He picked up his jacket from the back of the desk chair. He walked out of the east study and down the main corridor and through the front entrance and down the worn stone steps. And he told his driver to take the night off, and he walked to his own car and got in and sat there in the darkening afternoon with the engine off, and his hands on the wheel, and the understanding sitting in him like something finally settled. He was going to drive to Darrow Street. Not because the organization needed her, not because the council had told him to, not because Petra or the Meridian family or the arbitration filing or any of the dozen crises that she had helped him navigate in the last 18 hours required her to be there. He was going because she was Elara, and because what he had done to her was real, and because the only honest thing left available to him was to go and say so to her face and accept whatever she decided that was worth. He started the engine, and his phone lit up on the passenger seat with a message from a number he didn't recognize. And when he picked it up and read it, the blood in his chest went very still, because the message said 4 words, and those 4 words told him that Harlan Voss had not, in fact, decided that this was finished. The message said, "We have the painting." Matteo stared at the screen, the small landscape, the one Elara had taken from the Donna's suite in her single small suitcase, the one hanging above the writing desk in apartment 4C on Darrow Street, the one that meant Voss had been inside her apartment. She did not sleep. Ortega drove her back to the estate at 11 that night, and she sat in the office until 4 in the morning with the 9 names from Vale's folder laid out in front of her. Not the photographs, she'd memorized those. And she built the sequence the way she built everything, from the inside out, starting with the most fragile point and working toward the load-bearing ones. She drank 3 cups of coffee and ate half a piece of bread someone left on the counter and did not notice either. Dante came to the office at 2. He stood in the doorway and looked at the monitors and at his wife sitting in the cold light of them. And he did not ask questions. He went to the kitchen and made more coffee and brought it back and set it beside her elbow and pulled a chair to the corner of the room and sat in it. He didn't speak. He didn't offer. He just stayed, the way you stay with someone who is carrying something too heavy to carry alone but cannot yet put it down. At 3:30, Elena said without looking up, "The announcement at the gala, the night of. Did you want to do it?" A long pause. "No," Dante said. "I didn't want to do it. I'd been pulled toward it for months. Camille and Reeves suggesting it, and the way things had been between us, and..." He stopped. "I thought I wanted to. That night I thought it felt like power. About 45 minutes later I understood what I'd actually done. Before the attack, you were standing across the room and you didn't react. Not one muscle. And I felt..." His voice worked around something. "I felt like I'd hit a wall I didn't know was there." Elena looked up from the monitors. "Because I didn't fall apart. Because you looked at me like I was a problem you were reassessing." He met her eyes. "Which I was. Which I deserved to be." He leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees, hands loose. "I've been thinking about the thing you said. About Ren. About choosing yourself." He paused. "I've been thinking that you've spent 11 years choosing me, and the Empire, and everything that came with it, and not once in 11 years have I ever asked what it cost you. Not once." Elena looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the monitors. "It cost me Ren," she said. "And before that it cost me a version of myself that I wasn't sorry to lose. And then it cost me the thing I was most afraid to lose, which is the belief that I could stay clean." She set down the coffee. "After tomorrow, I won't be clean anymore. Not the way I've been defining it." "Elena." "I know what I'm doing, Dante. I've known since I picked up the gun. I'm not asking for permission, and I'm not asking you to feel good about it." She turned to face him fully. "What I'm asking is whether you trust me enough to do exactly what I tell you tomorrow without knowing why until it's already done." He didn't hesitate. "Yes." "Then here's what you're going to do." She told him. All of it. The sequence, the timing, the specific things she needed from him and from the security men and from Thomas Morrow. She talked for 30 minutes, and he listened the way he listened to nothing else, with the full weight of his attention, and when she finished, he sat quietly for a moment. "If Vale's people get to Morrow's before we neutralize all 9, he said, "it triggers anyway." "Yes." "And if it triggers, then it triggers. And Morrow and Bertolucci deal with the fires in their own houses. And Vale has started a war he doesn't have the infrastructure to finish because I've already pulled the ground out from under his network. He wins a battle and loses the campaign." She looked at her husband. "But he won't get to trigger it because I'm not going to give him the chance." Dante was quiet. "You're going to walk into that room tomorrow," he said slowly, "and you're going to stand in front of everyone, and you're going to look like you're doing what he wants. Until I'm not." Another silence. "He's going to have guns in that room," Dante said. "His people. Inside the Hargrove ballroom with the families assembled. If it goes wrong, it won't go wrong. Elena." His voice broke open just at the edge. "If it goes wrong." She looked at him. She let him see that she'd already sat with that, already turned it over and set it down, already made peace with the specific arithmetic of a situation where no option was without cost. She let him see all of it, and she watched him receive it, and she watched him choose to be the thing she needed tomorrow, instead of the thing he was afraid to lose tonight. "It won't go wrong," she said again. Gentler this time. He nodded once, and that was all. She was dressed and ready by 6. Black again. The same fundamental severity as the gala, deliberate, because she was walking into the same room, and the contrast between who she'd been standing against the north wall that night and who walked in today was a message she intended the room to receive without being told. She put the P226 at her hip, inside the waistband where the jacket covered it, and she stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom for exactly 10 seconds. The woman looking back was not the woman who had stood against the north wall of the Hargrove Ballroom 2 nights ago. That woman had been watching. This one had already decided. She walked out. The Hargrove Grand Hotel looked different at 7:50 in the morning. No chandeliers lit, no orchestra. The lobby marble was clean, but the air still carried the specific chemical memory of a space that had been forensically processed. The gala crime scene cleared, but the ghost of it hanging in the ventilation. Security staff on the doors were a combination of hotel people and family security from at least 3 different operations. Elena recognized 4 faces from 2 nights ago, and they recognized her. They let her through without a word. The ballroom had been set with a different configuration. Chairs arranged in the round, a central open floor, no podium. Vale's choice. No elevation, no structural authority, everyone equal, everyone watching everyone else. The specific geometry of a room designed to make a single speaker's position feel chosen rather than assigned. It was a thoughtful touch. She noted it and filed it. 41 people in the room when she entered. Heads of operations, senior lieutenants, the fixed points of the coast's power structure in a morning that was wrong enough to have them all in the same room on short notice. Thomas Morrow was against the right wall, and their eyes met when she came in, and she held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds. The signal they'd agreed on, the confirmation that his people had been moving since 5 this morning with the 9 names she'd sent the night before. He gave her nothing visible in return. A man who'd survived 63 years in this world knew how to hold his face. Felix Bertolucci was near the left wall, and he looked like he hadn't slept. He was watching Elena with the expression of a man who had been told something was happening today and had decided to believe it only when he saw it. Dante was near the back with 2 of the security men Elena had cleared. Not Reeves's people, 2 she'd promoted herself from the outer ring 3 years ago, and whose files she knew by heart. He was composed. He was exactly what she'd asked him to be. Vale was in the center of the open floor. He stood with Camille slightly behind his left shoulder, collected, composed, in a gray suit that was understated in a way that spoke of confidence rather than modesty. He looked at Elena entering, and his face did the small, warm thing that it did, the precise smile of a man whose model had just been confirmed. She was here. She'd come. He'd expected her at 20 hours, and she'd arrived at 20, and everything that followed was going to proceed exactly as designed. He believed that all the way until she opened her mouth. "Good morning," Elena said, and her voice carried the room the way it had carried Channel 11 2 nights ago. Not loud, not performed, just precise enough that the room organized itself around it. She moved to the center of the floor and stopped 12 feet from Vale, and the room settled. "Most of you know who I am," she said. "Some of you know me better than others. What all of you know is that the Valenti organization has operated on this coast for 20 years, and that for the last 11 of those years, the reason it survived is me. No apology in it, no pride either. Just fact, delivered at the temperature of fact. Not because I say so, because you've seen it. You've sat across tables from decisions I made that kept your operations intact when they shouldn't have been. You've benefited from intelligence I developed and threats I neutralized before they reached you, because the stability of this network serves everyone in this room." She let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. 2 nights ago, someone attacked this building and 2 men died on Valenti property. This man, she turned slightly, indicating Vale without looking away from the room, as though he were an exhibit rather than a threat. Marcus Vale. He ran the machine that attacked the gala. He has spent 4 years planning people inside your organizations. He has spent 12 years building toward a moment where he could walk into a room with all of you and demand a legitimacy transfer at the point of a loaded situation. The room was very still. Vale said, calmly, "I'd let her finish. She's going to endorse the transition. She just needs to arrive there her own way." He said it to the room, not to her. The specific move of a man confident enough in his position to absorb the attack and let the audience see him absorb it. "He's right that I'm going to finish," Elena said. "He's wrong about where I'm going." She reached into her jacket. Every armed person in the room moved, not toward her, but in the specific tensing of bodies that recalibrate the landscape when a hand goes toward a weapon. Vale's two men, behind him and to his right, both shifted weight. Elena's hand came out of the jacket, not with the P226, but with a folded set of papers, and she held them up so the room could see they were papers, and the tensing eased. 9 names, she said. 9 people that Vale inserted into your operations over 4 years, using Aldous Wren's inherited financial infrastructure and communication channels. As of 5 this morning, 7 of those 9 are in custody, held by the respective operations they were planted in. She looked at the room. Morrow's house is clean. Bertolucci's house is clean. 3 of the Gulf operators, your people are clean. She paused. Vale came to this room today believing he had 9 loaded weapons pointed at everyone here. He has 2. And those 2, she looked directly at Vale for the first time since she'd begun. Those 2 are going to stand down in about 40 seconds. Vale's face had done something she hadn't seen it do in the North Dock building or on the radio, or in any version of him she'd constructed over the last 2 days. It had gone very still. Not calm, still. The specific stillness of a man whose model has encountered a variable he did not account for and is running, fast, to find the place where it breaks down. You were watching Morrow, Vale said. His voice was still even. He was good. Last night, when you left my building, you went to Morrow. I went to Morrow 2 nights ago, Elena said, before I came to you, before I even knew the address. I called him from the car on the way to Benny Solis, and I told him to move on the names the moment I sent them, because I knew what I was going to find at Solis's, and I knew what you were going to show me when I got to the dock. She looked at him. I didn't figure out your 9 plants when I saw the folder. I already knew about 8 of them. I've been tracking anomalies in the coast's communication patterns for 3 years, Vale. Not just Reeves. All of it. I didn't know they traced to you. I didn't know the source, but I had the shapes of them. She let it settle. You've been studying me for 12 years, but you started 12 years ago. I've been building this specific capability for 3. The version of me you built your plan against doesn't exist anymore. You were 12 years late. Something cracked in Vale's stillness. Not outward, not visible to anyone who didn't know how to read a face the way Elena read a face, but she saw it. The hairline fracture running through the confidence. The specific moment a man understands that the ground he was standing on is not the ground he thought. You still have a problem, Vale said, and now he turned away from Elena and toward the room, because the room was still the room, and the room had not yet declared itself. Whatever she's done with my people in your organizations, I have resources you haven't found. I have capital you haven't traced. I have Wren's network, and you can clean your own houses, but you cannot clean mine. And if she ends me here today, I've left instructions that activate without me. He was not threatening now. He was recalibrating, which was more dangerous because a man who can recalibrate in real time while losing is a man who has reserves. Walk away from this, Elena. Take what you've done with the 9 plants, call it a victory, and walk away. What you cannot do is end me in this room without paying a price that reaches every person sitting here. It was not an empty play. Elena knew it wasn't empty because Vale did not make empty plays. He had something left. Maybe 2 things, maybe 1, maybe just enough. She could see Morrow measuring it from the wall. She could see Bertolucci's jaw tight. She could see 41 people in a room deciding whether what they'd just witnessed was enough, or whether the cost of the next step was worth it. She could walk away. Vale was right that she could walk away. Take the clean win. 7 of 9 plants neutralized, Vale's network exposed, his operation gutted in a single morning, and leave him in the room with whatever reserves he had left, diminished but alive, knowing that she had looked at the cost of finishing it and decided it was too high. 11 years ago she would have. 2 days ago she would have. She looked at Dante, standing at the back of the room. She found his face, and she let him find hers. And what passed between them in that 2 seconds was not a plan, and not a signal, and not a piece of the sequence she'd built overnight. It was the simpler thing, the thing that had been damaged and rebuilt in the space of 48 hours into something neither of them had had before. She looked back at Vale. You left instructions, she said. Activated if you're taken or killed. That's the remaining leverage. She nodded slowly as though confirming something to herself. Tell me how long after activation before they execute. Vale's eyes narrowed. Why? Because if it's more than 40 minutes, you have no leverage, Elena said. Because Reeves is in federal custody as of 6 this morning. She watched Vale's face. She watched it. Ortega had a contact, she said quietly. Not mine, his own. A federal investigator he'd been working with on a separate matter. Ortega made a call at 5 this morning, an hour before I sent the names tomorrow. Reeves gave them enough for a warrant inside 2 hours, because Reeves, when he finally understood that Vale had burned him as a disposable asset, decided that his own survival was worth more than loyalty to a man who'd already erased him. She paused. Your extraction team pulled him out. They kept him dark, but they delivered him to a location where Ortega's contact was already watching, because last night I told Ortega exactly where that location would be. She held Vale's eyes. The person your instructions run through, the communications relay, it's in federal hands, has been for 3 hours. Your dead man switch is dead. The room was absolutely silent. Vale stood in the center of it, and the stillness in his face was different now. Not the recalibrating stillness, but the final kind. The stillness of a man who has run his model to the last variable and found that the answer is not what he built his life around. He looked at Elena Valenti for a long moment. You knew, he said. You knew before you came to the dock last night. I knew you'd show me the folder, she said. I needed you to believe I didn't have the names yet, because if you thought I had them, you'd activate immediately and burn the relay before I could get to it. So I let you show me. I let you believe I was standing in your building being beaten. She let the room hear every word of it. And then I left and I called Morrow, and I sent Ortega to his federal contact, and I went home, and I slept 4 hours. She had not slept, but Vale didn't need to know that. 12 years, Vale said. The words came out of something hollow, and for the first time she heard the thing underneath all the patience and all the engineering, the grief that had driven it, the old man's second, the man who had believed in something and watched it destroyed and spent his whole remaining life trying to rebuild the architecture of a world where that destruction was answered. She heard it, and she was not unmoved by it, because she understood it better than he knew. 12 years for this? 12 years of running Wren's machine, Elena said, and her voice was quieter now, the courtroom tone dropping into something closer to honest. But Wren's machine wasn't yours, Vale. It was his. You've spent 12 years maintaining something a dead man built and calling it your own future. She held his gaze. I know what that looks like from the inside because I spent 6 months in Wren's operation doing the same thing. Carrying someone else's structure and telling myself it was what I was building toward. She paused. And then I walked away, and it nearly killed me to do it. And then I built my own. Something in Vale's face moved. She couldn't name it. It was too complicated and too old, and it had been building for longer than she'd known him, and it was not her to name. But the fight went out of him, not dramatically, not a collapse, nothing like Dante's rawness in the office. It was quieter than that, the specific deflation of a man whose engine has been running at maximum for 12 years and has just had the fuel cut. He stood in the center of the Hargrove ballroom, and he looked smaller than he had at the window of the North Dock warehouse, and the room full of the most dangerous people on the eastern seaboard watched him do it. I'll take him, Morrow said from the wall. It was not a question. Morrow walked forward with 2 of his men, and Vale looked at them coming and did not reach for the weapon Elena could see at his hip, because reaching for it was its own kind of admission that the model had failed and the game was done. And Marcus Vale, whatever else he was, had enough pride left to not make that move. He let Morrow's men take him by the arms, and they walked him toward the back of the ballroom, and he did not look at Elena again. Camille looked at her. Camille had not moved from Vale's left shoulder through any of it. She stood now in the center of the open floor with her gray suit and her careful composure, and she looked at Elena with the specific expression of a woman reassessing every calculation she'd made in the last 3 years and finding that the architecture had been wrong from the foundation. He recruited you after Dante, Elena said. It wasn't a question. Camille's chin came up slightly. Before, 2 months before Reeves brought me to Dante's attention. And you believed in what he was building. I believed in what he said it would become. Camille's voice was flat and even, the affect of a woman who had decided that the only thing left available to her was honesty. He was very convincing about the future. He always was. Yes, Elena said. He was. She looked at Camille for another moment. You're going to talk to the federal investigator. Everything. The financial structure, the network, the channels Wren built, all of it. You know more of it than Reeves does. And in return, I tell the right people that you cooperated fully and immediately. Elena held her eyes. Which you did. Right now. This is the immediately. Camille looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then she nodded, once, and one of Morrow's men who had stayed back came and took her by the arm, and she went without resistance and did not look at Dante as she passed him. The room exhaled. Not loudly. These were not people who exhaled loudly. But the pressure that had been in the air since Elena walked in, the collective held breath of 41 people deciding whether what they were witnessing was the end of something or the beginning of something worse. That pressure released, and what came in after it was something quieter and more complicated. The specific atmosphere of a room full of dangerous people who have just watched someone do something they could not have done themselves, and who are deciding how to feel about owing that fact to a woman they spent years looking through. Bertolucci crossed the room to Elena and stood in front of her and said nothing for a moment. He was 68 years old and had the face of a man who had buried more friends than he could comfortably count. Your husband told my people you built the protection network, he said. The whole thing. Not just the Valenti side. All of it. Some of it, Elena said. More than some. Bertolucci's eyes were steady on her. My son, the boy, 14, at the gala. You knew where he was in the dark. He was standing by the 3rd pillar on the east side. He'd moved there when the music changed. It was quieter. I'd seen him there 20 minutes before the lights went out. Bertolucci looked at her. Then he put out his hand. She shook it. It was the handshake of a man who was not thanking her for a service. It was the handshake of a man acknowledging an equal, and the specific weight of what that cost him. A man of his generation and his history acknowledging a woman that way in a room like this, she felt it, and she did not make a performance of receiving it. What happens next, Bertolucci said, with the Valenti operation, with the structure? It holds, Elena said. The architecture holds. The alliances hold. Everything Vale was trying to absorb remains exactly where it is. She looked at the room. What changes is that the people in this room know, going forward, who built the wall that's been keeping everyone here standing, not because I need the credit. She let her eyes move across the faces she knew and the ones she didn't. The 41 people who had come to this room expecting one outcome and would leave it carrying something different. Because the next time someone tries to come through it, you should know whose voice to listen to. There was no applause. That wasn't the room. What there was a specific quality of silence that was not emptiness but recognition, and she had been in enough rooms to know the difference. Oh, it took 4 more hours to finish it. The federal contact, a compact, serious woman named Vasquez, who had been Ortega's handler for 18 months on a completely separate matter, and who Elena had spoken to exactly once, at 5 that morning, for 11 minutes, arrived at the Hargrove with 2 vehicles and began the procedural machinery of folding a 12-year criminal infrastructure into a federal case. Elena sat across from Vasquez in a hotel conference room for 40 minutes and laid out the financial architecture she'd traced from the Wren accounts to Vale's operation, the 9 names, the communication relay, the mechanism of the gala attack. She laid it out the way she laid out everything, clean, sequenced, nothing extraneous. And Vasquez listened and asked 3 questions and wrote down 2 things and said, when Elena was done, if half this holds up in discovery, this is a career case. It'll hold up, Elena said. How are you this sure? Because I built it to hold up, Elena said. I've been building it to hold up for 3 years. I just didn't know whose case it was going to be. Vasquez looked at her for a moment. Then she said carefully, there are going to be questions about the Valenti operation itself, about your own role, about the nature of the information you've gathered and how you gathered it. I know, Elena said. You understand what I'm saying. I understand exactly what you're saying. Elena held the federal investigator's eyes. Ask your questions. I'll answer what I can answer. There are things I won't give you, and you know which things those are, and you're going to decide whether the 12-year network I just handed you is worth the things I won't give. My guess is it is. My guess is we both walk out of this room knowing what our limits are, and neither of us pushes past them. She waited. Is my guess right? Vasquez was quiet for a long moment. Your guess is right, she said. Elena nodded. She stood. She shook Vasquez's hand and walked out of the conference room and into the corridor and stood for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed and took 3 long, slow breaths with no one watching. Then she found Dante. He was in the lobby. He was sitting in one of the chairs they put in hotel lobbies to look welcoming, and he was leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose between them. And when she came around the corner, he looked up, and the look on his face was the one she'd been cataloging for 11 years, but had never quite seen in this form. Not relief exactly, and not pride. Something underneath both of those that had no efficient name. She sat in the chair beside him. Neither of them spoke for a minute. Reeves, Dante said finally. The federal thing. Ortega really had a contact. Ortega really had a contact. I found out about it 3 months ago when I reviewed his communication logs. I kept it filed in case it was ever useful. She looked at her hands in her lap. 3 months ago I thought it might be useful someday, in a general way. Last night I was very glad I'd kept the file. Dante made a sound that was almost a laugh. Almost. You keep files on everything. I keep files on everything. He was quiet. Then, the 9 plants. You said you'd been tracking 8 of them for 3 years. You had 8 and you didn't know where they were from. I knew they were from the same source. I didn't know the source. She turned her head to look at him. If I'd known it was Vale, I'd have found him 3 years ago. But all I had was a pattern with no origin. I was building toward it. Building toward it, he repeated, and at the same time building the protection network and running the family's security infrastructure. And he stopped. He looked at his hands. And living with a man who announced his girlfriend to a room full of crime lords. Yes, Elena said. How long? Dante said. How long did you know I was drifting? She thought about what to say. She thought about the careful answer and the true answer, and whether, in this corridor, after this week, she still had the energy to prefer the careful one. 3 years, she said. He absorbed it. He sat with it the way she sat with the hard things, turned it over, looked at the underside, set it down carefully. And you stayed, he said. I stayed. Why? She looked at the marble floor of the Hargrove lobby, at the crack in the second tile to the left of her shoe that probably no one else had noticed, at the specific ordinary imperfection of a surface that tried to look flawless. Because the Empire was worth it, she said, and because I love you, and because those 2 things got tangled up in a way I stopped being able to separate. She looked up at him. And because I knew that the drift wasn't permanent. I know you better than you know yourself, Dante. I've known you better than you know yourself since the 3rd year. The drift was vanity and complacency, and you had them the way powerful men always get them, and it was corrigible. Corrigible, he said softly. Fixable, she said. If it was broken enough to need fixing. He looked at her. And was it? She held his gaze. Ask me in a year. Something in his face, not a smile, but the beginning of the possibility of one, shifted. A year, he said. A year, she said. They sat in the lobby for another few minutes in the particular quiet of 2 people who have said the real things and have nothing left to perform. Then Dante stood and put his hand out, not to shake, but simply to hold, and she took it, and they walked out of the Hargrove Grand Hotel into the cold November afternoon. 3 months passed. The federal case moved through its early machinery quietly, the way federal cases did when the evidence was clean and the cooperating witnesses were motivated. Reeves provided testimony that locked the financial architecture in place. Camille provided the communication records and the network contacts and 12 months of logged interactions with Vale that proved the operation's scope. The case became, as Vasquez had predicted, a career case, and Vasquez had the grace never to call Elena about it again, except once, in January, to confirm a single point of financial record, and Elena answered the question and hung up. Vale was held without bail. Elena read the filing once and then filed it and did not read it again. The 9 plants, 7 in custody, 2 who had fled and been found within the week, were extracted from the coast's operations cleanly enough that the families held. Moro's operation lost a senior lieutenant and rebuilt around the loss within a month. Bertolucci's inner circle was restructured with people Bertolucci chose himself, without input or suggestion from Elena, which was the right way to do it. She told him so, and he said he knew. Ortega was promoted. He did not come work directly under Elena. She offered, and he declined politely because he had his own trajectory and he knew it, and she respected that more than his acceptance would have given her. She kept his number. She expected she would use it again someday. Delgado's family received what they needed to receive in the way these things were always handled: a number in an account, a phone call, an absence of questions. Elena made the call herself, to his wife, who was 28 and had a son she didn't yet have words for this with. And she listened more than she spoke, and she did not make promises about what it had meant because it was not her grief to define. She stayed on the phone for 20 minutes, and she said, at the end, only that he had been the best of them that night, and she meant it. And the wife said thank you and hung up, and Elena sat with the phone in her hand for a moment before she put it down. The Valenti Foundation Gala was rescheduled for February. Different venue, tighter coordination. The committee asked Elena to chair the security review, and she said yes and meant something different by yes than she had the first time. Dante trained every morning at 5. He called her in the evenings when he traveled. He did not revert to what he had been in the 3 years before the gala, and she watched for it without letting him see her watching, and by the 3rd month she stopped watching as often. Not because she trusted that people don't revert, she was too old and had seen too much to believe that, but because the specific quality of his attention had changed in a way she couldn't reduce to performance, and she had built her entire career on the ability to tell the difference. In January, on a Thursday evening, she was in the office going through a communication audit when Dante came in and leaned in the doorway and said, "Come to dinner." "I have the audit. The audit will be there in an hour." "So will you." He stood in the doorway for a moment, then he said, "Elena, come to dinner." She looked at him. At the doorway he filled, and the quiet way he was asking, and the specific patience in it that was new. Not the patience of a man who had performed learning from consequences, but the patience of a man who had actually been changed by them, who had sat with the cost of himself for 3 months and come out the other side of it, carrying the weight differently. She saved the audit. She closed the laptop. She came to dinner. They sat at the table in the kitchen because the dining room was too large for 2 people who were not performing anything, and they ate the food that had been left by the cook, and they drank a wine she'd opened 2 weeks ago that was still good, and they talked about small things, the foundation, a property matter in the city, a book she'd been reading, a story Ortega had told her about his mother, and none of it was important, and all of it was. At some point, Dante said, without preamble, "Do you think Ren deserved it?" She set down her glass. "What made you ask that?" "I've been thinking about it for 3 months." He turned the wine glass in his fingers. "You made a decision about a man's life. You decided to let him fall instead of warning him, and you've been carrying that as a moral debt ever since, and it's the debt that Vale was trying to collect." He looked up. "I want to know if you think you were wrong." She thought about it, the real version of the thought, not the refined one she'd been carrying for 14 years. "Ren was going to fall," she said. "The war was coming whether or not I warned him. I know that now the way I knew it then. The question was whether I went down with him or not." She looked at her hands on the table. "I chose not to go down with him. And 3 people died in the collapse who might not have died if I'd stayed and fought with him. And I have never found a clean answer to what I owe them." She looked up. "That's not a question that has a resolution, Dante. You carry it, or you put it down and become someone who put it down. I've been carrying it. I'll keep carrying it. It keeps me honest." Dante was quiet. "It kept you honest with me," he said. You could have ended things a dozen times in 3 years. You had more than enough to justify it. You didn't because I knew what I'd done to Ren, she said. Because walking away from the person you chose is something I know the shape of, and I was not willing to do it the same way twice. Not when there was a version where we didn't have to. She paused. There's a version where we don't have to. Dante set down his glass. I know, he said. The kitchen was quiet. Outside the window, the grounds were dark, and somewhere in the dark, the security men Elena had chosen were walking the perimeter, and the house was as safe as she could make it, which was safer than it looked, which was how she preferred things to be. She picked up her wine. He picked up his. They finished dinner without resolving anything that couldn't be resolved, which was most things, and left standing the things that could, which was enough. In the spring, the Valenti Foundation donated to 4 children's hospitals along the coast. Elena reviewed the grants. She changed 2 of the allocations to better match the actual gaps in pediatric care versus the gaps that looked better in photographs, and nobody overruled her, and the money went where it was needed. She did not attend the press event. She was in the office, auditing a communication anomaly she'd noticed 2 weeks earlier in a pattern that didn't yet have a shape. She made a file. She started watching. The woman who had been publicly abandoned in a ballroom, who had picked up a dead man's radio and commanded a security team through a war that was never supposed to be her war, who had spent 11 years building a wall between the world she lived in and the kind of damage that world could do. That woman did not become someone else after the storm. She became the fullest version of herself, the version that the watching had been preparing for, the version that understood that the clean hands and the loaded gun and the patient strategy and the decision to move were not different kinds of people, but one person at different moments in the same long game. The empire did not belong to whoever had the most pride. It never had. It belonged to whoever understood, clearly and without sentimentality, what the empire actually was. Not power, not fear, not the ability to raise a glass in a room full of dangerous people and have them look at you. It was trust, built in the dark, in small increments, over years, by a person willing to do the unglamorous work of holding things together when everything wanted to fall apart. Elena Marcelli. Valenti sat in the office in the April light with a new file open on the screen and a cup of coffee at her elbow and the specific quiet alertness of a woman who has stopped pretending she is not exactly who she is. And she got back to work.